one can't talk about railroads without discussing, well, the railroad. No, I don't mean the companies. I mean the railroad, the tracks. I mean, let's be fair about this. The railroad wouldn't be a railroad without them. That's like the whole thing, you know? Tracks as a whole actually predate modern locomotives and modern trains, dating back all the way to 1603 with the Wollaton Wagonway. Back then they used wooden rails, and of course there were no locomotives. And when it comes to trackage development, well, there wasn't a whole lot of progress until locomotives came into the fold, because they were much heavier. Now you'd think discussing the rails would be a fairly simple thing to do, but it's a surprisingly deep topic. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to focus on one thing at a time, and if this as well, I'll talk about other elements. But for now, let's talk about those things. Those things in between the rails. What are those? Well, actually, the answer depends on who you ask, but most people refer to them as ties. Sometimes cross ties in America, or railway tie in Canada, or railway sleeper in Australia and Britain. But regardless of what you decide to call them, I'm just going to go with ties because it's easier. These are rectangular supports for the rails that are pretty much required to be there in order to hold things together. When it comes to laying down track, well, especially like on the ground, the rails need to be fastened to something in order to stay secure. There's plenty of areas that tracks run where the normal ground just will not cut it. You need to have something there for support. And that's what the ties do. They hold the tracks in place so they don't get pushed far apart or fall out of line or anything that would be bad. And they have their own history that goes along with the tracks, of course. Like I said, the rails in themselves are a surprisingly deep topic. The rails are fastened to the ties by various methods. It actually depends on where you're at. In America, we usually use railroad spikes, which I'm sure plenty of you are quite familiar with, as they tend to be pretty common collector's items among rail fans. Not that we should go around stealing them, don't do that. I mean like in heritage railway gift shops or museums, railroad spikes are often sold in some capacity, since they're pretty common and relatively cheap. However, in other countries, sometimes they'll use base plates. There's actually a lot of different methods for attaching the rails to the ties. They are, in fact, their own topic as well. So let's just press forward and focus on the ties themselves. There are different varieties, and the earliest is not the one you would guess. As you might be saying, wouldn't the earliest one be wood, as it's definitely the most common? And no. Well, yes, they are the most common, but not the earliest. The earliest thing that could be called a railroad tie were stone blocks that were first used on the wagonways that I mentioned before. They usually were attached to the rails via rail chairs, and the nice thing about them in those days was that it allowed horses to tread in the middle of the path without the risk of them tripping. Since these were wagonways, well, there were plenty of horses, so it made sense at the time. But when things started changing and locomotives came into the fold, it was found that the stones were not going to work. They could only handle so much weight, let alone speed, and they weren't stable enough for the modern machines. So, newer railways began using wood. These are still probably the most common kind of railroad tie, particularly in America. In the early days they'd be shaped with axes, or sawed, to achieve two flat sides. They vary quite a bit too, because there are different kinds of wood. Now historically they've tried to utilize hardwoods like oak, but other lines do use softwoods instead, which are easier to treat, but are more susceptible to wear and tear. Wooden railroad ties are usually treated to make them last longer, most commonly with what's known as creosote. And as someone who's handled railroad ties in the past, let me assure you, creosote smells so bad, and it will get into everything it touches, including your hands and your clothes. Seriously, I had to move around several railroad ties for my Boy Scouts of America Eagle project, and I smelled like creosote for a week after that. There are other preservatives that are sometimes used, but it's almost always creosote. But the thing about creosote is that it's toxic. So in the modern day, railroads have been trying to use different treatment options, like copper azole instead. And there are types of wood that are much more durable and can actually be used untreated. Despite being the most common, of course, the wood has never been perfect. They will eventually rot, they can split, And no matter how much creosote you dump on them, bugs will eventually stop caring. Plus, there's only so much wood to go around. And while trees are a renewable resource, they don't grow that quickly. So other options have been incorporated to try to provide railways alternatives. For example, concrete. Concrete ties had the benefit of being able to carry higher axle weights and sustain higher speeds, simply because concrete is just sturdier than wood. They also tend to have a longer service life and require less maintenance overall, being in the habit of staying still a lot longer. Some countries have standards that require the use of concrete ties. Over in the UK, Network Rail makes them mandatory on their high-speed, high-tonnage lines, purely because they're just the better option. And they've become much more popular over the years, especially in Europe. There also do exist steel ties as well. And you might be saying, wait, isn't the track made of steel? And yes, and these ties are also made of steel. Everything's steel, okay? In their case, the ends of the ties are shaped into a bit of a spade, which increases their lateral resistance, and they can be made with the housing system already intact, so there's no drilling or hammering necessary to attach the rails in the first place. Now, the thought to make the ties out of steel has existed as long as the rails have too, but the problem was, back in the day, they didn't have the best designs, and they were just more expensive than wood, so they didn't do it. But modern steel ties are handled much better and can deal with very heavy loads. In some cases, they're even more economical to install in new construction. And there's also plastic ties. Yes, really, this is a pretty recent idea, and has been started up by a number of companies who have created composite railroad ties that are manufactured from recycled plastic resins, as well as recycled rubber. Their claim is that they have a longer service life than the wooden ties, and since they're plastic, they don't rot, and insects aren't as keen to eat them. Being made from recycled material is of course a plus, and some railroads globally have started testing them, but the verdict's still out as to how widespread the practice will become. And that's covering the major materials, but what about the shape? Well, you might be saying, it's a rectangle. Duh. Well, I bet you think you're super clever and funny, but technically, it'd be a cuboid, because it's 3D. So, yeah, there's that. But besides that cleverly inserted geometry lesson, not all railroad ties are shaped like that. To begin with, there are Y-shaped ties, which are, well, laid out in the shape of a Y, and these were first developed in 1983. These ties have the benefit of requiring less ballast, since the vast majority of lines need some kind of crushed rock underneath the ties in order to support them. The Ys don't need as much, which is a nice benefit, but tracks laid out this way tend to be a lot louder. Only 1,000 kilometers of Y track have been built. 90% of that, mind you, is in Germany, so yeah, you probably haven't ever seen these. There are also twin ties, which is a pair of two pre-stressed concrete ties longitudinally connected by 4 steel rods. These specialized ties are suitable for track with sharp curves. Then there are wide ties, which, given the name, it just means the ties are wider. They're generally concrete, and they're so wide that there's no ballast between them. They increase lateral resistance and reduce ballast pressure. There are also bi-block ties, sometimes called twin blocks, and these are funny. They consist of 2 concrete rail supports joined by a steel bar, so they're kind of steel ties and concrete ties combined in that way. The advantage provided by them is that they have increased lateral resistance and lower weight than regular concrete ties. These are most commonly used in France, and they actually like them for their high-speed TGV lines. They can also be utilized in ballastless track systems, and they're gauge convertible because all you have to do is cut the steel bar and weld it to the dimension that you need. Easily gauge convertible. I said, easily gauge convertible. I said, easily gauge! Frame ties comprise both lateral and longitudinal members in a single monolithic concrete casting. And these are used in Austria. The track is fastened at 4 corners of the frame and is also supported midway along it. The frame ties tend to provide better support, and the construction method to utilize them is not that different from regular track. And there's also ladder track. The ladder track is kind of a bigger topic, but when it comes to the ties, they're laid parallel to the rails, not perpendicular. The track is called a ladder track because it looks like a ladder. These can be used with ballast or with elastomer supports on a solid non-ballasted support. They're kind of a specialty thing. In any event, the point is that railroad ties are very common and very wildly all over the world. And even when they're taken away and replaced, they still have their uses. They're big and heavy, and are good for retaining walls as well as raised bed gardens, though, especially with the latter, if you're gonna do that, make sure it's one of the kind of ties that doesn't have something like creosote in it. Trust me, you'll smell it, you'll know. Because, again, it's toxic, so it's not a very good idea to use with a garden. But if you get a hold of one of the ones that don't have the toxic chemicals, you're absolutely fine, and utilizing them for outdoor landscaping is a surprisingly common activity unless you're in Germany. This is a fun fact that I didn't know until researching this video, but the use of wooden railroad ties specifically as a building material has been prohibited by law in Germany since 1991. This is because they feel they pose a significant risk to health and the local environment. It's still regulated as far as my research seems to show, but you can still use, not wooden ones, I guess. Anywho, regardless of what form they take, railroad ties are an alarmingly common, consistent part of railroading that are likely to remain around for a pretty long time. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord R444, Royal Heads 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhound, Stub Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holden, G Wiz, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Eric Hutton, Kurt Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Ray 78, Nylon, AET Museum, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, Liam Wright, DM Travel Typhoon, Harry, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, the World of Fun. Farewell.